Hello everyone, and welcome to Lamplight and Historian. I'm Charles. In the winter of 1095, a curious sight began appearing in villages across France. Men and women were cutting small pieces of cloth into the shape of a cross, then sewing them, stitch by stitch, onto their cloaks. The piece of cloth was small. The promise behind it was almost unbearably heavy. Before we continue, welcome to the light of this lamp. Perhaps you are preparing to sleep, spending a quiet evening alone, or simply looking for a little distance from the noise of the present day. Whatever has brought you here, I hope this journey into the past will help you slow down and settle into the night. If you enjoy history told gently in the darkness, you are welcome to like the video or subscribe to Lamplight and Historian. There is no obligation, of course. Stay only if you truly enjoy what we do here. You may also leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening and what time it is there. There is something quietly comforting in knowing that, in another city or another country, someone else is sitting beneath a dim light, waiting to hear the same distant story. So lower the lights, find a comfortable place, and let the sounds of the day begin to fade. Tonight, our story begins with a small cross sewn onto a travelling cloak at the beginning of the First Crusade. From the moment the cross was fastened to the shoulder, its wearer was making a public declaration. He or she would leave familiar fields and roads behind, pass through kingdoms, mountains, and straits they had never seen, and travel more than 2,000 miles toward Jerusalem. Some were knights who had trained for war since childhood. Most were not. They were farmers, craftsmen, priests, servants, women, elderly people, and children. They did not speak a single language. They did not belong to one army. They did not even possess a map that everyone agreed upon. They knew only that they had made a vow before God. 4 years later, some of them would climb over the walls of Jerusalem and fall to their knees in tears inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Many more would die on the roads of Hungary, in the wastes of Anatolia, in the trenches outside Antioch, and beneath the burning sun of Palestine. And while the Crusaders celebrated their arrival in the Holy City, the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem would endure a massacre. No single person had designed this ending. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios wanted a body of Western soldiers that he could direct. Pope Urban hoped to turn the violence of Western knights toward the east. The princes carried faith with them, but also honour, debt, family rivalry, and a hunger for land. Ordinary pilgrims may have wanted nothing more than to complete the promise they had made. They wore the same sign and walked toward the same city, but they never truly shared the same purpose. This is not simply the story of an army marching from Europe to Jerusalem. It is the story of how thousands of private choices gathered into a movement that no one could fully control. In an ordinary French village, the first step toward the expedition was not the drawing of a sword. It was not the mounting of a war horse. It took place inside a church. A man or woman stood before a priest and publicly promised to travel east. Afterwards, a cross of cloth was sewn onto the traveller's clothing. From that day onward, neighbours would see it during worship. Creditors would notice it in the market. Family members would see it every morning as preparations continued. The cloth made the vow impossible to hide. Yet sewing on the cross was the easiest part. The real difficulty was everything that came afterwards. If a farmer left, who would sow the fields? Who would bring in the harvest? If a craftsman closed his workshop, how would his wife and children live? And if a great lord intended to take hundreds of knights with him, he needed an astonishing sum of money for horses, armour, grain, tents, servants, and everything the army would have to purchase along the road. Some men sold land. Others mortgaged estates to monasteries. Old debts and disputes were settled before departure. Many arranged inheritance rights for wives and children. Some donated part of their property to the church and asked monks to continue praying for their souls if they died. They were not preparing for a short campaign. They were arranging their lives on the assumption that they might never return. For poorer travellers, the questions were smaller, but no less serious. How far could one pair of shoes carry a person? When the leather wore through, where would the next pair come from? Should the family's few tools be sold now, in exchange for bread on the road? For someone who had never travelled more than a few days from home, 2,000 miles was almost beyond imagination. He knew the name Jerusalem, but he could not know how many rivers, mountains, currencies, tolls, and armed frontiers stood between his village and the holy city. Pope Urban had instructed the expedition to depart in August 1096. After the main harvest, he appointed Adhemar, Bishop of Le Puy, as his religious representative, hoping that the delay would give the princes time to gather food, money, and men. The problem was that the movement had no true central authority. One lord called together his vassals. A preacher attracted a different crowd. Neighbours followed neighbours, and relatives followed relatives. The message travelled through churches, markets, and monasteries, changing a little each time it was repeated. Across Europe, thousands of people made the same decision in separate places, without knowing how many others were doing the same. When they said farewell to their families, and followed the familiar village road toward the unknown, the cross remained on their shoulders. It reminded them why they had left. But it could not feed them. It could not repay their debts. And it could not answer a question that was becoming more dangerous with every passing month. When all these strangers finally came together, who would command them, while families in Western Europe were settling property and preparing for departure? Constantinople was facing a very different crisis, several hundred miles to the east. The city was still the capital of the Roman Empire. Its inhabitants did not call themselves Byzantines. That name would be given to them by later historians. They called themselves Romans. Officials recorded taxes. Ships carried grain into the harbour. Orders from the emperor moved through an administrative system that had survived, in one form or another, for centuries. From a Western perspective, this was a state wealthier, larger, and more sophisticated than any kingdom in Europe, yet it was losing the land that made its survival possible. Much of the empire's grain, tax income, and military manpower came from Anatolia, across the Bosphorus. In 1071, Emperor Romanus IV met the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan at Manzikert. The Byzantine army was defeated, and Romanus was taken prisoner. But the battle itself was not the most fatal part of the disaster. What followed was worse. When Romanos returned from captivity, political rivals overthrew him. Byzantine commanders fought for the throne. Some invited Turkish warbands into imperial territory as temporary allies. These agreements were meant to solve immediate problems. Instead, they gave more and more Turkish leaders the opportunity to settle in Anatolia. Cities, valleys, and roads slipped from imperial control one by one. By the time Alexios I Komnenos took the throne in 1081, a Turkish ruler had established his court at Nicaea. The city lay alarmingly close to Constantinople, almost within sight across the water. Alexios understood that the empire could not recover Anatolia with its existing forces alone. He was accustomed to employing foreign soldiers. The famous Varangian Guard at his palace had long been recruited from northern Europe, and by his reign it included many Englishmen whose families had left England after the Norman conquest. So the emperor made what seemed to him a perfectly reasonable decision. He asked the West for military assistance. In March 1095, Byzantine envoys attended a church council at Piacenza in northern Italy. They described the difficulties facing Eastern Christians and explained that Turkish powers were occupying lands the empire still regarded as its own. Alexios probably hoped for a limited force of Western warriors, men who could be paid, directed by imperial officers, and used to recover Nicaea and other important cities before Byzantine rule was restored. He did not ask Western princes to build independent states in the East. He did not ask a vast European army to conquer Jerusalem. But the Byzantine envoys were not speaking to a military contractor whose task was to recruit a few companies of mercenaries. They were speaking to Pope Urban II, Alexios had presented a problem of imperial security. Urban heard the possibility of reshaping the entire Western Christian world. The emperor believed he was borrowing a sword. He did not realize that he had just struck a spark into a field of dry grass. In November 1095, the town of Clermont in central France, filled with bishops, abbots, knights, and local people, Pope Urban II to preside over a church council. The gathering discussed such matters as clerical marriage, the sale of church offices, and the private life of the King of France. Yet, everyone knew the Pope intended to speak about something more important. Urban was not a ruler sitting securely in Rome and issuing commands to an obedient Western world. He was locked in a struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over the right to appoint bishops. His enemies supported a rival pope. Urban often could not remain safely in Rome and had to travel from place to place, gathering support from bishops, monasteries, and nobles. He also faced another long-standing problem. The knights of Western Europe were extremely good at killing one another. They fought private wars over land, inheritance, family honor, and old grudges. When money was short, some robbed churches, villages, or merchants. The Church had attempted to limit this violence through movements known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The results had been limited. Urban did not ask the knights to lay down their weapons. He offered them a new enemy, and he offered their violence a new meaning. We do not know the exact words he spoke at Clermont. Every surviving version was written later, and the chroniclers did not remember the details in the same way. But the central message is clear. Urban spoke of Eastern Christians who needed help. He spoke of Jerusalem, of the places associated with Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection. Then he joined the ancient practice of pilgrimage to an organized military expedition. If a person went east out of sincere devotion rather than simple greed, the journey could serve as penance for confessed sins. For knights who had spent their lives fighting and who feared the judgment that violence might bring upon their souls, the offer was almost impossible to ignore. They did not first have to cease being warriors. They could use warfare itself to answer for the sins warfare had created. Later accounts say the crowd cried out, "God wills it." Some people knelt and took the vow on the spot. Strips of cloth were cut into crosses and sewn onto clothing. The gesture required no great registration system and no royal decree of conscription. A priest, a piece of cloth, and a public promise were enough to create another participant. Urban had made practical preparations. He ordered the expedition to wait until the following August, giving people time to gather money and supplies. He appointed Adhemar of Lapuy as his representative. He discouraged the elderly, the seriously ill, and monks travelling without permission from joining. He wanted an organized expedition led by nobles who had the resources to sustain it. But once the message left Clermont, it no longer belonged to Urban alone. Pretchers carried it from one town and village to the next. Careful conditions disappeared. Cautious restrictions were forgotten. People remembered the parts that travelled most easily. Go to Jerusalem. Complete an act of penance. Find salvation. Beneath the same cross, entirely different expectations began to gather. The emperor wanted to recover imperial territory. The Pope wanted to aid Eastern Christians and strengthen his authority. Knights thought about sin, honour, and glory. Poorer people thought about redemption. Others imagined adventure or opportunity. They had been given one sign and one direction. They had not been given one purpose. More dangerously still, some people had already decided not to wait for the departure date Urban had chosen. In the spring of 1096, the Pope's instructions were clear. The expedition was to wait until after the harvest. But across northern France and along the Rhine, growing crowds of people wearing crosses were already taking to the road. The man drawing many of them forward was a small, roughly dressed preacher known as Peter the Hermit. Peter rode from town to town on a donkey. He possessed neither the wealth of a prince nor anything that could truly be called an army. But he understood how to make ordinary people believe that God's summons was not meant only for a few trained knights. It was meant for everyone. Farmers put down their tools. Craftsmen closed their workshops. Women joined with their children. Elderly people and the poor came as well, together with a small number of men who had actually been trained to fight. Seen from a distance, the gathering looked like a holy army, growing larger by the day. Seen from within, it had no dependable supply system, no accepted chain of command, and no guarantee that one group would obey Peter, or even cooperate with the next. Before they had left Western Europe, violence began. The Rhine cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz were home to Jewish communities that had lived there for generations. Some crusading leaders asked a terrible question. If they were travelling thousands of miles to fight, those they called the enemies of Christ, why should they spare the Jews living beside them? The Pope had given no such order. Some bishops risked their own safety by sheltering Jewish families inside episcopal residences. But the religious appeal had already been reinterpreted by armed crowds. Robbery, forced conversion, and killing followed. The expedition had not yet seen a Turkish soldier. Its first victims were neighbours in European towns. And this was only the beginning of the loss of control. As the travellers followed the Danube through Hungary and the Balkans, the simplest problem became deadly. What were all these people going to eat? A town might be able to supply a few dozen merchants. It could not suddenly feed several thousand travellers. Arguments in markets turned into theft. Theft brought armed resistance. People who believed they were marching to help Eastern Christians found themselves fighting Christians whose lands they were crossing. By the time Peter's following reached Constantinople, hunger, disease, and conflict had already reduced its numbers. The moment Alexios saw them, he understood that this was not the military force he had requested. He offered Peter assistance, but also gave him repeated warnings. Wait for the armies of the princes. Do not attempt to fight the Turks near Nicaea alone. Yet keeping thousands of hungry, excited travellers outside the capital created dangers of its own. Farms and buildings in the suburbs were plundered. So the emperor transported them across the Bosphorus and settled them near a place called Civitot. His order was simple: remain close to the coast. Wait for reinforcements. The camp soon divided against itself. French-speaking groups quarrelled with Germans, and Italians over food and leadership. Armed parties moved deeper into Turkish territory to raid. A few small successes convinced others that the enemy was weak. Then, in October 1096, a report reached the camp. Another crusading group, it was said, had captured Nicaea and was dividing the treasure. The report was false. The people in the camp did not know that. A large crowd hurried out toward the city. The column was badly organized. Women, elderly people, and children followed behind the armed men. Sultan Kilij Arslan had already prepared an ambush. Mounted archers appeared on both sides of the road. Arrows fell. The column broke almost at once. Some tried to run back to the camp. Others fled toward an abandoned fortress near the sea. Most did not escape within a few hours. A great crowd that had believed God was travelling beside it had almost ceased to exist. Peter the Hermit was away from the camp when the disaster occurred, and so he survived. Kilij Arslan drew a dangerous conclusion from his easy victory. The Crusaders coming out of the west, he believed, were an undisciplined rabble that could be scattered without difficulty. He would soon discover that the next men to cross the Bosphorus were very different. While the People's Crusade was being destroyed in Anatolia, the Western princes, who could actually sustain a war, were still preparing. They mortgaged estates, sold rights, borrowed silver, and bought war horses and grain. No reigning king of Western Europe joined the First Crusade. Command therefore fell to a collection of dukes and counts of roughly similar rank, each accustomed to ruling his own lands, and none willing to submit easily to another. A few faces among them are worth remembering, because they will return again and again throughout this story. Raymond of Toulouse was already past 50. He was one of the wealthiest and most experienced leaders. He was devout, proud, and convinced that his age and position entitled him to stand at the center of the expedition. Godfrey of Bouillon, from Lorraine, possessed a strong reputation and a steadier manner. His younger brother Baldwin had less land and a sharper eye for opportunity. No one yet knew that Baldwin, who began the journey in his brother's company, would first seize Edessa and later become king of Jerusalem. The most dangerous man came from southern Italy. Bohemond of Taranto was a Norman prince, tall, charismatic, militarily gifted, and intensely ambitious. He had fought against Emperor Alexios in the past and knew something of Byzantine roads, armies, and politics. If the other princes gradually discovered the opportunities of the East, Bohemond may have been imagining from the beginning whether he could win a state there for himself. These lords did not form one united army. They followed different routes toward Constantinople, because no single road could feed all their followers, and because none wished to accept another prince's authority before it was absolutely necessary. By the winter of 1096, fields outside the imperial capital were crowded with tents, carts, horses, and unfamiliar soldiers. Alexios needed them. He was also afraid of them. He had already watched the People's Crusade plunder the outskirts of his capital. The forces now approaching his walls were not starving crowds. They were disciplined noble armies, capable of threatening an entire state. The emperor therefore received the princes separately. He did not want all their armies gathered together near Constantinople at the same time. He imposed a condition. The crusading leaders were to recognize his authority and promise that former Byzantine cities recovered during the expedition would be returned to the empire. In exchange, Alexios would provide money, guides, provisions, and ships to carry them across the Bosphorus. From the emperor's point of view, the arrangement was entirely reasonable. From the prince's point of view, it looked very different. They had sold or mortgaged their own lands. They had brought their own soldiers east. They had taken a religious vow under the authority of the Pope. They did not believe they were merely hired swords in the service of a distant emperor. Godfrey was the first to resist the oath. The dispute became tied to food. Byzantine officials restricted the markets. Crusaders began seizing supplies from the countryside. Fighting even broke out outside the capital. They had not yet met the Turkish enemy. The allies were already drawing weapons against one another. Eventually, under pressure, Godfrey accepted the emperor's terms. Alexios immediately restored the markets and showered him with gifts, as though the confrontation had never happened. Bohemond behaved very differently. The Norman who had once invaded Byzantine territory entered the palace smiling and agreed to the oath with surprising ease. He hoped cooperation might earn him a powerful imperial office. He also hoped to lower Alexios's guard. Both men knew the other could not be trusted. Both behaved like the most courteous of allies. Raymond refused to become the emperor's vassal. He insisted that he had come east in the service of God alone. After long negotiation, he agreed not to harm Alexios or imperial interests. But he did not accept the full relationship the emperor wanted. An agreement had been reached. The real dispute remained unresolved. To Alexios, cities such as Nicaea and Antioch were Roman cities, temporarily lost to enemies. Once recovered, they belonged to the empire, to the princes. A city taken through their own siege, sacrifice, and blood might look very much like a prize. In the spring of 1097, the crusading armies crossed the Bosphorus. Only months earlier, the bones of the People's Crusade had lain scattered along nearby roads. Now heavily armed knights gathered on the same ground. Their first objective was Nicaea, the capital of Kilij Arslan. Their first true victory would also create the first deep fracture between the Crusaders and Byzantium. Nicaea possessed strong walls, and its western side touched a large lake. The Crusaders could block the roads, but they could not prevent boats from carrying supplies into the city. As long as the lake remained open, the siege could not be complete. More surprisingly, Kilij Arslan was not inside his capital. After his easy destruction of the People's Crusade at Civito, he had concluded that the Westerners posed no serious danger. He had left Nicaea to fight another Turkish ruler. His wife, his children, and his treasury remained behind. Only when reports arrived, describing large numbers of Western knights, supported by Byzantine troops, did the Sultan understand his mistake. He hurried back and attacked the crusading lines from the south, hoping to break through to the city. This time, the Western army held its formation. Its separate forces supported one another. After a hard day of fighting, Kilij Arslan withdrew. The defenders inside Nicaea had lost their best hope of rescue. Alexios then solved the problem of the lake. Small Byzantine ships were placed on wheeled frames and dragged overland to the water. Once launched, Imperial crews closed the last open route into the city. Nicaea's final lifeline had been cut. The Crusaders believed only one task remained. They would storm the walls, enter the city, and claim prisoners, treasure, and glory. Then one morning they looked up. The banners flying above the walls were not signaling an assault. They were Byzantine. Alexios had been negotiating secretly with the garrison, rather than wait for a hungry Western army to break into the city. The defenders had agreed to surrender to the emperor. In return, Byzantium promised protection for the inhabitants and the soldiers. The gates were handed over during the night. Most crusaders were kept outside. From the emperor's perspective, it was a perfect victory. The city had not been looted. Its population and defences remained intact. An important former imperial centre had returned to Byzantine rule. To the ordinary soldiers beyond the walls, it felt very different. Guarded, suffered, and bled for the siege. Now they were denied entry. The treasure they had expected disappeared from reach. Even the family of Kilij Arslan was treated with honour and later released. Alexios distributed money and gifts to calm the princes. The alliance continued, at least in appearance. But a dangerous idea had entered the Crusaders' minds. If the Byzantines intended to take the victory only at the final moment, why should the Westerners continue honouring the oaths they had sworn in Constantinople? After leaving Nicaea, the enormous host divided into two columns so that it could find enough food along the road. The decision made sense. It also created exactly the opportunity Kilij Arslan had been waiting for. At dawn on the 1st of July 1097, Bohemond's forward column was striking tents and watering horses near Dorylaeum. The first Turkish riders were already appearing around the camp. The Turkish mounted archers did not charge forward and accept the kind of close combat preferred by Western knights. They rode around the camp, approached, released their arrows, and withdrew before the heavily armed cavalry could reach them. Bohemond's column contained more than soldiers. There were servants, women, carts, and animals inside the camp. If the knights lost patience and chased the riders, everything behind them would be exposed. Bohemond ordered his men to stay together. Knights dismounted where necessary and formed a defensive line beside the infantry. Women and other non-combatants gathered in the centre. Carts, baggage, and tents became improvised barriers. Arrows continued to fall. Horses collapsed. The number of wounded grew. Everyone knew that the second crusading column was somewhere behind them. No one knew when it would arrive. The longer the fighting continued, the closer Kilij Arslan came to destroying them. Then dust and banners appeared at the far edge of the battlefield. Godfrey, Raymond, and the other princes had arrived. The Turkish army had intended to destroy half the crusading force. It now faced the entire host. Fresh troops spread out from new directions. Kilij Arslan could no longer surround Bohemond's position, and he withdrew. It was the Crusaders' first great victory in open battle. They had proved that, if they held their formation and supported one another, they would not collapse as the People's Crusade had done. But victory at Dorylaeum did not solve the road ahead. Kilij Arslan stopped offering them a major battle. He withdrew food, livestock, and whatever supplies could be removed. As the Crusaders entered the Anatolian interior, Their enemies became heat, thirst, and the terrible length of their own column. A spring might provide enough water for a village. It could not supply tens of thousands of people and animals at once. Those at the front drank first. Those behind them found mud. The war horses began to die. A knight who lost his horse did not lose his courage or his armor, but he could no longer fight in the manner for which he had trained all his life. When pack animals collapsed, grain, tents, and tools had to be carried by people, or abandoned beside the road. The sick and the very young fell behind. A family that stopped to care for one exhausted member might never see the main column again. The Crusaders had defeated a Turkish army. Now the road began consuming them one by one. It was during this crossing that Baldwin made the decision that would transform his life. Instead of remaining with the main army, he took a smaller force eastward toward Edessa, beyond the Euphrates. The city had a largely Eastern Christian population. Its ruler, Thoros, faced enemies beyond the walls and opposition within them. Baldwin's following was not large. It was exactly the kind of military support Thoros needed. Through a local ceremony, Thoros adopted Baldwin as his son and heir, hoping to make the Western prince his protector. The arrangement did not last. A revolt soon broke out in the city. Thoros was killed. The surviving evidence cannot prove whether Baldwin helped plan his death. What is certain is that, when power appeared before him, Baldwin accepted it without hesitation. Early in 1098, the younger brother who had left Europe, with little independent land, became ruler of Edessa. It was the first lasting Latin state created by the Crusade. It had not been part of Urban's plan. It was not handed to Alexios. The expedition had not yet reached Jerusalem, and one prince had already found his destination beside the road. The main army continued without him. When the survivors finally crossed the mountains into northern Syria, they saw a city far larger than Nicaea. The walls of Antioch followed the valley, climbed a steep mountain ridge, and were guarded by hundreds of towers. A citadel stood above them all. The Crusaders did not have enough men even to surround the city completely. But they had no way around it. The road to Jerusalem passed beneath those walls. In October 1097, the Crusaders made camp outside Antioch. At first, many believed the siege would not last long. They had defeated Kilij Arslan at Dorylaeum. They had crossed Anatolia. Some towns along the road had already chosen negotiation over resistance. Perhaps Antioch would lose hope after a few gates were blocked. But Antioch was too large. Its walls stretched for miles beside the Orontes River, and then climbed the steep slopes of Mount Silpius. The Crusaders did not have enough men to seal every entrance. Supplies still entered through gates and paths they could not control, while small forces from the city attacked isolated camps and foraging parties. Worse still, the defenders and the besiegers depended on the same countryside. When winter came, the grain and livestock near the city quickly disappeared. The Crusaders had to travel farther and farther in search of food. Those who went out risked ambush. Those who stayed watched the grain sacks grow lighter. Horses died for lack of fodder. The price of bread rose beyond the means of ordinary soldiers. Some people boiled leather. Others searched for roots. Some slipped away from the camp at night. A siege was supposed to starve the people inside the walls. At Antioch, the army outside began to break first. Yagi Sian, the governor of the city, was not simply waiting. He feared that Antioch's Christian inhabitants might help the Crusaders. He therefore expelled some Christian men, while keeping their wives and children inside as a guarantee. Families were torn apart before the worst of the winter had even begun. Yagi Sian also sent urgent appeals to Muslim rulers across the region. Relief forces arrived more than once. For a time, the crusading princes set aside their rivalries and defeated them outside the walls. Each victory allowed the siege to continue. None brought the city much closer to falling. By spring, supplies began arriving from the coast, and the Crusaders built new fortified positions to control more of the gates. But a greater danger was gathering in the east. Kerbeger, the ruler of Mosul, was assembling a coalition far larger than any previous relief army. If he reached Antioch while the city still held, the Crusaders would be trapped between the walls and an overwhelming force. Bohemond understood that time was running out. He also understood that this might be his only opportunity to claim Antioch for himself. He offered the other princes a bargain. If he found a way to get the army into the city, Antioch should belong to him. Some objected. They had sworn to return former Byzantine territory to the emperor. But as Kerberga drew nearer, principles began to lose their weight. Bohemond had already made secret contact with a man inside the city, usually known in the sources as Firuz. He was responsible for guarding part of the walls. Why Firuz agreed to betray Yagi, Sian is uncertain. Perhaps he had a private grievance. Perhaps he expected payment. Whatever the reason, he promised to lower a rope ladder at night. In the first days of June, 1098, the Crusaders moved quietly through the darkness. A small group reached the agreed tower. A ladder descended from above. The first man began to climb. If Firuz changed his mind, if a guard shouted, if one piece of armor struck stone too loudly, 8 months of siege could end in disaster before Kerberga arrived. But no alarm sounded. One man reached the top, then another, and another. Before dawn, the Crusaders were inside Antioch. The first men over the wall killed the nearby guards and opened a gate. Crusaders waiting in the darkness poured into Antioch. By sunrise, the city had fallen into chaos. Soldiers hunted down defenders in the streets. Civilians were killed as well. Antioch had a substantial Christian population, and in the confusion, some local Christians were killed by the very army that claimed to have come to aid them. Yagi, Sian fled the city. He was later killed by local people, and his severed head was carried back to the Crusaders. After 8 months, the siege was over. But the victory was incomplete. The citadel high above the city remained in Turkish hands. Its garrison could attack downward at any moment. More dangerously, Antioch's food supplies were almost exhausted. 2 or 3 days later, Kerberga's army appeared on the horizon. The entire situation reversed in an instant. The Crusaders had been the besiegers. Now they were trapped inside the city they had just captured. The largest enemy force they had yet faced stood outside the walls. While a hostile garrison watched them from the mountain above, they had taken Antioch. They had also locked themselves inside a prison with almost no food. Men began to desert. Stephen of Blois had already left the camp before the city fell. On the road, he met Emperor Alexios, who was finally advancing with a Byzantine relief force. Stephen told him the expedition was lost. Alexios turned back. From the emperor's point of view, there was little reason to sacrifice his army in a battle that had already ended in disaster. To the Crusaders who later survived, his withdrawal became proof of Byzantine betrayal. They did not know that false information had convinced him to retreat. They knew only that, at the moment of greatest need, Alexios had not come. Inside Antioch, despair deepened. Then a poor proven, ill-named Peter Bartholomew came forward with an extraordinary claim. St. Andrew, he said, had appeared to him in dreams and revealed that the spear which pierced the side of Christ was buried beneath the floor of the church of St. Peter in Antioch. Adhemar of Lisieux was deeply sceptical. Constantinople already possessed another object said to be the Holy Lance. But hungry men began to dig. They worked for hours and found nothing. At last, Peter himself climbed into the pit and produced a piece of iron from the earth. Those who believed saw a miracle. Those who doubted saw an object that could easily have been hidden in advance. The argument was never settled. Its effect was real. The lance did not create food. It gave frightened men a reason to believe that leaving the city did not necessarily mean death. Fasting, prayers, and processions restored a measure of order. On the 28th of June 1098, the Crusaders marched out through the gates. They were outnumbered. Many knights no longer possessed healthy horses. Kerberga commanded a coalition that appeared far stronger, but his army was less united than it looked. Several of the rulers serving beneath him feared his ambition. They did not want to help him become master of Antioch. The Crusaders did not collapse. Some of Kerbogha's allies began to withdraw. Others followed. The enormous army outside the walls suddenly lost the will to fight as one body. Kerbogha retreated. Against almost every reasonable expectation, the Crusaders survived. The Turkish garrison in the citadel surrendered when it saw that no help remained. Bohemond's banner rose above the fortress, making it clear who now intended to control Antioch. It was one of the most remarkable reversals of the entire expedition. But the moment the common danger disappeared, the old ambitions returned. Bohemond argued that Alexios had failed to come to their aid. The oath made at Constantinople, he said, was therefore void. Antioch belonged to him. Raymond insisted that the city should still be returned to the emperor. He also had no desire to see Bohemond become the most powerful Western prince in the East. Together, they had saved the expedition from destruction. Now they seemed capable of ending the journey to Jerusalem through a quarrel over the reward. After Kerbogha's defeat, the leaders promised that the army would rest and then continue south. Summer passed, autumn nearly ended. Jerusalem was still hundreds of miles away. Bohemond increasingly treated Antioch as his own city. It had walls, taxes, roads, and the potential to become the center of a new principality. Compared with a distant sacred destination, Antioch was immediate and real. Raymond refused to recognize Bohemond's claim. Each man occupied different parts of the city. Then Adhemar of Lipi died during an epidemic. He had been the one figure whose authority stood above the princes because he represented the Pope. With Adhemar gone, no one could compel the rivals to agree. The ordinary crusaders grew furious. They had lost relatives, horses, money, and years of their lives. Most did not care which prince ruled Antioch. Their vow had been to reach Jerusalem. In search of food and a route south, part of the army besieged Marat, al-Numan. Both the town and the crusaders outside it approached starvation. When Marat finally fell, the soldiers expected to find stores of grain. They found deeper hunger. Several crusading chronicles report that some desperate people cut flesh from the dead and ate it. We cannot know how many were involved, and later accounts may have exaggerated the horror. But Christians recorded the story with shame, and Muslims repeated it with fear, because the famine had clearly pushed part of the army beyond ordinary human restraint. Then, after taking a town that had almost nothing left, Bohemond and Raymond began quarrelling over it. The poorer infantry finally acted for themselves. They tore down sections of Marat's walls. If a prince wanted to stay and rule the town, the soldiers would make it impossible to defend. Some even threatened to return to Antioch and dismantle its fortifications if the leaders continued to delay the pilgrimage. This was not meaningless anger from powerless men. The nobles depended on them to carry equipment, guard camps, man siege lines, and fill the ranks of the infantry. Without them, no prince, however wealthy, could continue the war. The pressure worked. Bohemond chose Antioch and abandoned the journey to Jerusalem. Raymond resumed the march in January 1099. One account describes him walking barefoot at the head of the column, attempting to show that he remained a pilgrim rather than merely a count searching for territory. Even then, the delays were not finished. Raymond stopped at Arca, hoping to capture a stronghold for himself. The siege continued for weeks and achieved nothing. At the same time, the controversy surrounding the Holy Lance returned. Peter Bartholomew agreed to an ordeal by fire. Carrying the lance, he walked between two lines of flame. He emerged terribly injured and died several days later. His supporters claimed the crowd had crushed and wounded him after he survived. His opponents believed the fire had exposed his fraud. The object that had helped unite the army in Antioch no longer possessed the same power. Once again, a simple demand spread through the ranks. We did not come for these towns. The siege of Arca was abandoned. The Crusaders continued south along the Mediterranean coast. Many local rulers opened markets, and offered food, asking only that this dangerous and hungry army keep moving. Baldwin had chosen Edessa. Bohemond had chosen Antioch. Those who remained finally chose Jerusalem again. By 1099, Jerusalem was no longer controlled by the Seljuk powers. The Crusaders had fought in Anatolia and northern Syria. The Fatimid dynasty of Egypt had recently taken the city from Turkish rulers. Its governor, Iftikhar al-Dawla, knew a Western army was approaching. He also knew that reinforcements from Egypt would require time. He prepared for a siege. Livestock outside the city was driven away. Some wells were damaged or sealed. Many local Christians were expelled because the governor feared they might open the gates to the Crusaders. Both sides claimed to be fighting for religion. The local inhabitants were the first to lose their homes. The Crusaders continued south. By now, they had learned that not every city needed to be attacked. If coastal rulers provided markets and supplies, the army was willing to pass. The force that entered Palestine was far smaller than the army that had stood outside Nicaea. Many had died. Some had gone home. Baldwin remained in Edessa, and Bohemond in Antioch. Perhaps only a little more than 10,000 fighting men reached Jerusalem, with knights forming only a small part of that number. On the 7th of June, 1099, they finally saw the city. Some fell to their knees, some wept. For 3 years, Jerusalem had existed in sermons, scripture, and imagination. Now its walls stood before them in stone. The hope lasted only a short time. The city was strongly fortified. The Crusaders did not have enough men to surround it completely. More urgently, there was almost no water near the camps. Long lines formed at the few remaining springs. The water was often muddy. Soldiers walked miles beneath the sun in search of other sources, while Fatimid cavalry attacked the water parties. Again, the horses began dying before the men. After reaching Jerusalem, the first enemy the Crusaders faced was not the wall. It was thirst. 6 days later, they launched a hurried assault. Men carried ladders toward the defences. There were too few of them. Some were not long enough. The defenders hurled stones and shot arrows from above. The attack failed. Faith and courage alone could not cross a stone wall. The Crusaders needed siege towers, rope, nails, carpenters, and above all, timber. The country around Jerusalem did not contain enough tall trees. Then a Genoese fleet arrived at Jaffa, threatened by Fatimid ships. The sailors could not safely keep their vessels in the harbour. They made an extreme decision. They dismantled their own ships. Masts, beams, ropes, and iron fittings were taken apart and carried inland over several days. Carpenters in the crusading camps began constructing 2 enormous siege towers. The defenders inside Jerusalem could hear hammering by day and night. They strengthened the walls and prepared arrows, stones, and fire. On the 8th of July, the Crusaders fasted and walked barefoot in procession around the city. The ritual did not weaken the walls. It briefly placed quarrelling princes and exhausted soldiers inside the same purpose. Then Godfrey's men dismantled their siege tower during the night and moved it to a different section of the northern wall. The defenders had concentrated their preparations against the original position. By the time they understood what had happened, they could not move every engine and obstacle in time. On the night of the 14th of July, soldiers slept beside the towers, repairing ropes and boards. They knew food and water would not allow another long delay. The defenders knew that if they endured only a few more days, the heat might defeat the army outside without their help. Before sunrise, the Crusaders began their final assault. On the morning of the 15th of July, the northern wall of Jerusalem was surrounded by smoke, shouting, and the grinding sound of timber under strain. The defenders hurled stones and burning material onto the siege tower. The Crusaders covered parts of the structure with wet hides. Below, men worked beneath a rain of arrows, filling the ditch and forcing the heavy wooden tower closer to the wall. Raymond's attack in the south made little progress. In the north, Godfrey's tower finally came close enough. Archers on its upper platform drove defenders away from the battlements. The attackers set fire to protective material hanging from the wall, and thick smoke forced part of the garrison back. A wooden bridge dropped from the tower. 2 knights from Flanders were among the first to cross onto the battlements. More men followed. If the Crusaders could hold even this narrow section of wall, they could attack the neighbouring defenders from the side. Godfrey himself climbed onto the fortifications. Then a gate was opened from within. The soldiers waiting below flooded into the city. The northern defence began to collapse. Iftikhar al-Dawla, the Fatimid governor, withdrew into the western citadel. There he negotiated with Raymond. The governor and the soldiers beside him would surrender the fortress in exchange for safe passage out of Jerusalem. The agreement saved Iftikhar and part of his garrison. Most people in the city had no such protection. Jerusalem had been taken by assault, not surrendered while its walls remained secure. According to the customs of war familiar to the attackers, soldiers who forced their way into a resisting city expected the right to kill, take captives, and plunder. That did not mean every inhabitant had to die. It made large-scale violence extremely difficult to prevent. Crusaders entered houses and religious buildings in search of soldiers and valuables. Large numbers of Muslim inhabitants were killed in streets, homes, and around the Temple Mount. Tancred had given his banner to some of the people sheltering in the sacred enclosure, perhaps as a promise of protection. Other Crusaders entered and killed them anyway. Even if Tancred was angered afterwards, nothing could restore the dead. Some of Jerusalem's Jewish inhabitants gathered inside a synagogue. The sources report that Crusaders set the building on fire and killed those within. Medieval Christian chroniclers described the slaughter in extreme language. Some wrote of blood rising through the streets. Such images drew upon biblical language and should not be treated as precise measurements. But rhetorical exaggeration does not mean the massacre did not occur. Muslim and Jewish residents were killed in large numbers. Others were captured, held for ransom, or forced to clear bodies from the city. Some escaped in the confusion. Then came one of the most disturbing scenes of the entire First Crusade. Some Crusaders washed dirt and blood from themselves, changed their clothing, and walked toward the church of the Holy Sepulchre. They laid down their weapons. They knelt inside the sacred place they had spent 3 years trying to reach. Some touched the stones. Some wept. Some thanked God for allowing them to complete their vow. The killing in the streets and the prayers inside the church took place on the same day. Modern observers find it difficult to place those two acts beside one another. Many of the Crusaders did not see them as contradictions. They understood victory as a form of divine judgment, and they accepted the violent customs attached to the storming of a city. Understanding those beliefs helps explain how they acted. It does not erase the experience of those who suffered. 3 years earlier, they had sewn crosses onto their cloaks in the hope of saving their souls. Now, they had reached their destination, and the streets of the holy city were filled with bodies. The war was not yet over. Egypt was gathering an army to drive the small western force out of Jerusalem. After the capture of Jerusalem, the Crusaders finally faced a question they had postponed throughout the journey. They possessed the city. Who would rule it? Most ordinary participants believed their vows had been fulfilled. They wanted to go home. But if everyone left, Jerusalem would soon be lost. The princes first offered authority to Raymond of Toulouse. Raymond refused. Perhaps the decision came from genuine religious hesitation. Perhaps he did not want an office whose powers had already been limited by others. The leadership then passed to Godfrey of Bouillon. He did not take the title of king. Instead, he became the advocate, or protector, of the Holy Sepulchre. A famous later tradition says that Godfrey would not wear a crown of gold in the city, where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. The words may never have been his, whatever title he used. Godfrey immediately began performing the duties of a secular ruler. He appointed officials, controlled soldiers, organized revenues, and tried to secure the roads. He had almost no time to establish order. The Fatimid vizier Al-Afdal was marching north with an Egyptian army. The Crusaders did not remain inside Jerusalem and wait to be besieged. They moved south and attacked near Ascalon before the Fatimid force had fully prepared for battle. On the 12th of August, 1099, the Egyptian army was defeated. The victory secured Jerusalem and is often treated as the military conclusion of the First Crusade. Yet, even in the final battle, the princes continued to quarrel. The garrison of Ascalon was willing to surrender to Raymond. Godfrey refused to allow his rival to gain control of such an important city. The Crusaders therefore won the battle, but failed to receive the fortress. Ascalon remained in Fatimid hands and continued to threaten the kingdom of Jerusalem for decades. It was an appropriate ending to the expedition. The Crusaders could defeat a common enemy. They repeatedly struggled to defeat their own pride. After Ascalon, large numbers of participants began the journey home. Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and many other lords travelled west. They carried relics, loot, and stories that would change a little with every retelling. Some returned to estates managed for years by relatives. Some discovered that their debts had been waiting patiently. Poorer travellers might find that the tools and homes sold before departure could not simply be recovered. Completing a religious vow did not restore the life a person had left behind. Many families welcomed no one home at all. Their relatives had died somewhere along the road, often in a place whose name was never reported back to the village. Those who remained faced a different future. Godfrey ruled Jerusalem for less than a year before falling ill and dying. His brother Baldwin left Edessa and came south. Unlike Godfrey, he accepted a crown without hesitation. On Christmas Day in 1100, Baldwin was crowned at Bethlehem as the first king of Jerusalem. The younger brother, who had begun the expedition with little land of his own, now held its most important throne. But a crown did not make the kingdom safe. Jerusalem lay inland, far from the coast. Its western population was small. The roads around it could be cut at any time. The new kingdom needed ports, reinforcements, and settlers. It also depended upon local farmers, merchants, translators, and officials to keep society functioning. The Crusaders had completed a pilgrimage. Those who stayed had to begin building a state. After the First Crusade, 4 Latin-ruled states emerged in the eastern Mediterranean. Edessa came first. Taken by Baldwin after he left the main route, Antioch came under Bohemond, despite his oath to return former Byzantine territory to Alexios. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established in 1099. Raymond and his successors later created the county of Tripoli along the coast. No council had designed these 4 states in advance. They were not the final pieces of a grand plan. Each grew from choices made by different men during different crises. Baldwin used a political vacuum in Edessa. Bohemond exploited betrayal inside Antioch and used Alexios's failure to arrive as a reason to keep the city. Jerusalem required a government after its capture. Tripoli emerged from another local war that continued for years. The 4 states shared Latin Christianity and sometimes depended upon one another for military support. They never became one country. Their rulers competed for ports, titles, and territory. When useful, they negotiated and even formed alliances with neighboring Muslim rulers. Religious language often divided the world into 2 simple opposing camps. Politics in the region was never so orderly. The new states could not survive through a small number of Western settlers alone. Armenians, Greeks, Syriac Christians, Muslims, and Jews continued to cultivate land, run markets, translate documents, and administer taxes. Conditions varied from place to place. Some communities remained under negotiated agreements. Others experienced expulsion, forced labour, or the loss of property. For Byzantium, the result was equally complicated. Alexios had used the crusading armies to recover Nicaea and some territory in western Anatolia. He also watched Antioch become an independent Norman principality. He had originally hoped to acquire a tool. What he received were several new neighbours he could not control. For the Western Church, the success of the expedition demonstrated that a pope could summon people from many different lands into a shared undertaking. It also gave lasting strength to the idea of armed pilgrimage and holy war, encouraging later crusades and the military orders created to defend the Holy Land and its pilgrims. For the Muslim world, the fall of Jerusalem and the violence of its capture left a deep wound. At first, Muslim rulers remained divided by local rivalries. The continued existence of the Crusader states eventually encouraged stronger movements of unification and counterattack. For the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, the memory of the Crusade did not begin in Jerusalem. It began in their own streets and inside the residences of bishops who had tried to shelter them. Different people remembered entirely different parts of the same movement. Western Christian chronicles emphasized vows rewarded by victory. Muslim accounts remembered lost cities and violence against their inhabitants. Jewish records preserved the destruction that occurred before the Crusaders had even left Europe. Urban II did not live to receive reliable news of the victory. He died on the 29th of July 1099. 2 weeks after the capture of Jerusalem. The message probably had not yet reached Rome. Urban had called for aid to Eastern Christians and a penitential journey to Jerusalem. He had never described the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, or the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the crowd at Clermont. But the movement begun by a cross of cloth had travelled far beyond the intentions of the Pope, the Emperor, and the people who first took the vow. Ending, the old cloak was finally folded away after the fighting. The gates of Jerusalem opened again. Only the guards had changed. Merchants brought grain into the city. Residents searched for missing relatives. The new rulers inspected empty houses. The streets had to be cleared. Wells had to be protected. Bread still had to be baked. Animals still had to be taken outside the walls to graze. Conquering a city might require only the opening of a gate. Keeping a city alive required the people who had already lived there. For the rulers who remained, the real difficulties were beginning. For those who returned west, the story moved back to a quieter place. Perhaps one crusader eventually walked into his village again. He was older than when he had left. He was poorer. He carried wounds. The children in his household had grown. His debts might still be unpaid. His estate or workshop might have changed beyond recognition. Other families never heard the familiar footsteps outside their doors. The cloth cross that had once displayed the vow in public had completed its purpose. It had passed through rain, dust, hunger, battle, and thousands of miles on foot. When the journey ended, it no longer needed to remain on the shoulder. In an ordinary home, the worn travelling cloak might finally be folded and placed beside the family's other old clothing. But the story it had helped begin could not be folded away with it. A limited request from an emperor became a call from a pope. Private vows made by farmers and knights became an army no one could fully control. The road passed through the despair of Antioch, the massacre at Jerusalem, the completion of a pilgrimage, and the creation of 4 states that no one had planned. The First Crusade changed everyone who took part in it. It also changed the Mediterranean world for centuries. They believed they were walking toward a holy city. In truth, they were walking into history.